You're gonna hit start, and then I'll do my little intro and welcome you on if that sounds good. All right, here we go. All right, thank you all for hopping on. I see more people trickling on, so I'll just give it about another 30 seconds to a minute here. All right, it is 12:31 Central Time, so we will go ahead and get started. Thank you all for hopping on today. Really appreciate your time. Please let us know if you are unable to see the screen. But very excited to bring you this webinar from the National Safety Council. Excited to present the findings of a collaborative research project from the Campbell Institute. The research dives into the intricacies of safety training programs, exploring key considerations and innovative approaches to ensure effectiveness. So this webinar is being recorded and it will be emailed to all registrants probably early next week. If you do have any questions, please feel free to use the Q&A feature on your screen. But without further ado, I'd like to welcome Kenna Carlson, a Senior Research Associate at NSC. Kenna, go ahead.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. Hi, everybody. As Stephanie said, my name is Kenna Carlson, and I am a Senior Research Associate with the National Safety Council. And I was one of the primary researchers involved in this topic. So today we'll be delving into the world of safety training and discussing some of the key considerations to strengthen your training programs, to make them more accessible for employees, and to give them some strategies to measure the effectiveness of your program. So it's my hope that whether you are mature in your safety training journey, or if this is something new to you, that there's some key insights that you can take away that may help you strengthen your programs down the line. So for a general overview, we will start with a basic overview of the project and talk about some of the methodologies and the objectives that we were looking for while we were doing this research. And then I have developing a sound training program broken up into 3 key steps. The first step is the development of your program. The second is the delivery of your training. And the third is measuring the effectiveness of your training program. We will also present a series of poll questions during this webinar, which will allow me to better get to know all of you. And it can also help inform some of the future research and the direction of the Campbell Institute. So if you could answer those poll questions, that'll be really helpful to us as we move forward. And as Steph said, please leave any questions in the Q&A, and we will certainly try to get to as many of those at the end as we can. So we will start with a little bit of introduction and a background into this topic and kind of how we landed on it. So we know that training is important. I don't need to tell you that safety training is important. Safety training provides workers with the education and the hands-on skills that they need to do their jobs safely and to avoid creating other potential hazards. So we know that safety training is so important to reducing serious injuries and fatalities, to building a strong safety culture, and for communicating those effective strategies down to our frontline workers. Training is also a regulatory requirement. Right now, there are over 100 OSHA standards containing requirements for training. So when we typically think about safety training, we usually think of things like the ability to recognize and control for certain hazards, practicing safe work practices and policies, the proper use of personal protective equipment, how to don it, how to use it, when it should be used. And of course, emergency procedures, things like your evacuation procedures, administering first aid or CPR, fire safety, or crisis communication. So we know that training is vitally important, but what's more important is effective safety training. So while we were conducting this research, we were able to talk to a lot of member organizations from the National Safety Council. And what we found was that a lot of organizations have metrics in place to evaluate their training efforts, but most organizations are lacking a systematic approach toward evaluating effectiveness. And this is important because the difference between an effective and an ineffective program can really influence the safety and productivity of our employees. So what we know from the research is that effective training can increase knowledge retention. It can increase safe work practices in your workplace. It can provide workers with the ability to proactively recognize and control for hazards. It can improve your safety culture. And of course, the key is it can help reduce those workplace injuries. However, we also know from the research that there can be some downsides if this training is ineffective or poorly delivered. So looking at the research, ineffective training has been linked to negating those potential safety benefits. It can diminish the financial return or the resources that you put into that training program. It can reduce productivity. So if employees don't have the necessary skills that they need to do their job, it can reduce their efficiency, it can increase their error rates, and it can make them less engaged in their work overall. Ineffective safety training can also lead to unfavorable safety attitudes. So where employees feel like the training wasn't applicable to them, if they feel like it was too difficult to understand, or if it wasn't accessible to them, it can really impact their attitudes towards safety and negatively impact the culture that we are all trying so hard to build within our organizations. And of course, if your training is ineffective, it's not going to have the potential to influence your safety outcomes. It may, in fact, increase the risk of injury if they are not performing a job safely or have the knowledge to perform a job safely. So effective safety training is really what we want to land on. So you'll hear me talking throughout this webinar about a sound training program or an effective safety training program. And really what I am referring to is these 4 core characteristics. So OSHA did a general review of training best practices, and they found that there are kind of 4 key characteristics that sound training programs have in common. The first is that they're accurate, right? That they're prepared by qualified individuals, that they're updated as needed, whether as the literature progresses, as we get to know how employees respond to things better, or as regulations or legislation is updated. It should also be facilitated by experienced trainers. A sound program is also credible. So facilitators should have an EHS background or be a subject matter expert on that topic. And this really allows them to answer questions, to pull from their personal experience, and to be able to demonstrate those safe work practices. And all of this can really help build up credibility in the minds of employees as they are going through this training. The training materials should be clear, it should be understandable, and it should account for literacy levels and language barriers. And we'll talk a little bit about tailoring your training program to your employees in just a little bit. And lastly, it should be practical. So workers should see this information as being directly useful to their work. I think we've all experienced going through a training that we've done a dozen times before, or something that we feel like it's not relevant to us. And that can be really frustrating. And you'll see at the top corner, I included this little meme, and I just thought that was funny because all of this is easier said than done, right? So building a sound training program can be difficult, especially in safety programs. There are unique challenges that exist that make it really difficult to implement a strong program. So oftentimes our safety programs are often mandated by employers or regulators. So in some cases, workers can feel a reduced sense of autonomy or like they don't have a choice in their training. Bureaucracy is another huge hurdle. So workers may feel overburdened if they need to take redundant or irrelevant trainings. This can frustrate them, and this can call into question the legitimacy or the credibility of the training program. And some of these skills may only be useful in emergency situations. And this can really limit the opportunity for workers to apply this knowledge in a realistic setting. So we'll talk through some of the ways that we can manage these challenges and try to build these strong programs regardless of those things that we maybe can't control. So I wanted to start really quickly with a poll question. So I will be launching this poll question. And the question that I have for you should pop up for you right now. What is the biggest challenge your organization faces in implementing effective safety training? So I'm curious, is your biggest challenge engaging with employees? Is it the limited time or resources? Is it navigating language or literacy barriers? Is it identifying training needs, or is it measuring training effectiveness? And I will give you all just a couple more seconds to answer this poll, but I'm seeing these answers flooding in here. Thank you all for answering this. All right, I see it's starting to slow down a little bit. So it looks like the greatest challenge, with about 40% of you agreeing, is limited time or resources, followed by pretty closely with engaging with employees and measuring training effectiveness. So this is really helpful. Hopefully we can touch on some of these subjects today. And if not, we can certainly try to elaborate on some of these questions in the future to help you out. All right. So while we were doing this project and within this webinar, we had sort of three key objectives in mind. The first was to review the key considerations that are involved in developing and delivering an effective program. So we'll talk about some of those key strategies and techniques to really strengthen your program. The second is we wanted to evaluate the use of certain evaluation models for measuring training effectiveness, including introducing a new pre-test, post-test design that was actually created by members of a working group we formed. And the last is we wanted to share insights and best practices from the Campbell Institute's Training Effectiveness Work Group. So through this research, we sort of used a mixed methods approach to answer these questions. This involved a thorough review of existing academic literature on training best practices. We conducted interviews with members of the National Safety Council, and we formed a dedicated Campbell Institute Training Effectiveness Work Group. And this provided a platform for organizations to share some of their best practices, to ask questions, to share their success stories, and to help inform this work. So I wanted to take a really quick moment up on the screen to thank the members of this work group who contributed their insights, because we quite literally could not have done it without them. So I wanted to shout out that work group. And throughout the duration, you'll hear me talk about some of these member organizations and share some key tips and some key insights that they have shared with us that'll hopefully help inform some of your safety training programs. But thank you again to that work group. All right, so we're through the introduction, we're through the background, and now we're going to get into the first step of building a strong program, which is going to be training development. So this is all about understanding what your needs are, planning out which modality you want to use, planning who needs to be involved in the training, and some of those considerations in planning out your program. So typically the first step that you're going to want to look for is your needs assessment. So a needs assessment is the systematic process of identifying the training needs of employees based on existing gaps and skill deficiencies. So what this really means is we want to know what your workers need to know to do their jobs safely and effectively. And you want to understand what the current knowledge level is within your workforce and identify the training needs based off of those gaps. So I gave an example here. A representative from the Dow Corporation actually shared with us what their needs assessment process looks like. So in that first step, they identify the roles. So You want to identify the core competencies to perform a job or a duty. And this can come from reviewing your standard operating procedures, from conducting hazard analyses and understanding what those most significant risks are, looking at OSHA standards or regulations, looking at the literature, or benchmarking off of others. So in this first step, let's use the example. You are interested in understanding what safety training is necessary for machine operators in an industrial environment. So you're going to look at the standard operating procedures. You're going to understand what they need to know, what risks they're exposed to. You might talk to the employees and understand what their risks are. And then you'll move to the second step, and that is identifying the necessary skills. So you'll want to know what current competency levels are. So let's say you are interested particularly in lockout tagout. In order to identify those necessary skills, you may conduct interviews with your workers. Try to assess how much they understand about lockout tagout. Do they understand the procedures? Do they understand what it's used for? You may conduct direct observations and make sure that they are performing those duties and maintaining the safety of the machines. Or you could look at incident reports or assessments and really understand where your high risk jobs or duties are. And if you find that there are some gaps that perhaps employees don't quite understand lockout tagout, perhaps there are components to that they struggle with, or they don't understand why it's necessary, then you can develop your learning objectives from there. But really, this is all about understanding gaps, understanding what employees need to know, what they currently know, and what needs to be improved or built upon. So next we move on to learning objectives. So now you understand what your workers need to improve on, and from there you build out your learning objectives. So learning objectives really just refer to what a worker can do, what they can explain, or what they can demonstrate at the end of a training period. For learning objectives, I like to use Bloom's taxonomy. This is one of many frameworks that categorize goals. So Bloom's taxonomy in particular categorizes goals into 6 levels of complexity. So as you go up this pyramid, it becomes more challenging and it involves more advanced problem-solving skills and knowledge from the employees or the trainees themselves. And we'll talk about each step of Bloom's taxonomy in just a moment. But just keep in mind, this is all about building strong learning objectives and making sure that workers are learning what they need to learn and are able to demonstrate what they need to demonstrate. So at that first level, you have knowledge. So knowledge-based objectives aim to provide trainees with the basic principles and concepts that they need to know. So let's use the example of personal protective equipment. At the knowledge level of Bloom's taxonomy, participants would essentially be able to identify different types of PPE and maybe understand their basic uses in the workplace. So you'll want to make sure that they have that basic knowledge and understanding before you move to the next level, which is comprehension. At this stage, the trainees should be able to demonstrate that they understand those underlying principles in broader contexts. So at that first stage, they could identify different types of PPE and their uses. At the comprehension stage, they may be able to explain the importance of PPE or talk about the potential consequences of not wearing it. But in essence, they have a broader understanding of PPE within the context of their own workplace and the consequences if they don it incorrectly or if they do not wear it. And then you have application. So application-based objectives require trainees to apply their knowledge in real-world scenarios. In the case of PPE, this may involve having workers don PPE according to manufacturer instructions and safety guidelines. At this step, it's largely demonstrative. So they should be able to demonstrate to you that they can safely wear it and they know when is the appropriate time to don that PPE. We're moving on up in the pyramid. The next stage is analysis. At this stage, trainees should be able to apply critical thinking to the knowledge acquired. This can include analyzing safety protocols or root cause analysis. With the example of PPE, at this stage, workers might be able to identify properly or improperly used PPE and suggest corrections. So this essentially means that they have the knowledge, they understand how to wear it, they understand why it's used, and now they can take that a step further and look at somebody else and understand if it's properly or improperly worn. The next level is synthesis. This involves the creation of new strategies and procedures. And with these last two levels, these are really digging into those critical thinking skills and having workers go beyond compliance and having them really think about safety more holistically and how it impacts the organization. So at the synthesis level, workers can start to think about new types of PPE or have them consider, in a perfect world, what type of PPE might be useful for your job. Really having them think outside the box and think critically about personal protective equipment. And then lastly, we have the evaluation stage. At this stage, attendees critically evaluate existing safety programs, assess their effectiveness, and propose improvements. So at this stage, you can have learners think critically about their roles and jobs and examine the existing safety guidelines and propose changes, maybe new or additional PPE, maybe making changes to existing PPE. But this level is really important because where workers feel like they're involved, they tend to be more engaged. And where they're more engaged, there tends to be higher knowledge retention. So that evaluation stage can be really, really helpful in making sure that your employees don't feel like safety is something that is imposed on them, but they feel like it's something that they are involved in building. And they can really feel a sense like they are influencing policy and making it stronger. And that can be really huge toward building your safety culture as well. So that is Bloom's taxonomy. And again, that's all about just building out your safety learning objectives. Another thing you want to do is consider your audience. So you want to understand your target audience and what factors may impact their training experience. So if we think about things like age, experience, and tenure, you'll want to think about what training experience do they have. You might put out a questionnaire that asks, what training modules have you taken in the past? What work have you done before? Are they relatively new to the workforce or are they more experienced? And all of this can help make sure that they're not taking redundant trainings, but making sure that they're getting refreshers where needed and they are getting appropriate training if they are new or inexperienced to a certain role. You'll want to consider language barriers or literacy levels. So this is a huge component of training. Where workers, obviously, if they can't understand the language, or if there are specific words or specific language barriers in place, it's going to be harder for them to understand the context of the training, to understand how to apply that training. So literacy and language barriers can really play a huge role in differentiating between an effective and an ineffective safety training program. So whether that means having your materials translated professionally, having an interpreter in your classroom training, having someone who is bilingual, or even just having someone, a trusted member of your team who can help translate these materials to their coworkers, all of that can really, really help workers understand the training and make it more accessible to them. You also want to think about the type of employee. So ideally, organizations should employ similar approaches for their contingent workers, for their day laborers, for temporary workers. But in essence, you want to make sure that your training is being communicated, regardless if they are full-time workers for your organization or if they are brought in from another organization, if they're day laborers, whatever the case may be. You'll want to make sure that you are at least communicating your training down to those folks so that they can safely perform that job as well. And then you'll want to consider learning styles. So I'll talk a little bit about learning styles. But in essence, the goal of safety training should be as accessible as possible. So making sure that you are addressing the needs of your audience. So when I'm talking about learning styles, there tends to be 4 different styles, and you're likely probably familiar with these, right? So the first is visual. These types of people tend to learn by seeing. So they may benefit from videos or images, from infographics, from charts or graphs, from watching videos, from watching demonstrations. Next, you have those folks who learn best through reading or writing. So for those individuals, they may benefit from training manuals. They may need a physical book or a physical handbook that they can flip through and read through. They may benefit from case studies or learning from others who have already put these trainings out there. You have oral learners. These people tend to learn best by hearing. So perhaps you have audio recordings. Maybe you have a podcast style training that they can just put into their ears and listen to. You may have interactive discussions where they can hear folks talking back and forth about controlling for hazards or identifying for hazards. Or lectures can be really helpful to these folks. And then you have your kinesthetic learners. These people tend to learn best by doing. So in this case, you may have hands-on activities, you may have simulations or field exercises. So the strongest training programs tend to have a mix of all 4 of these learning styles. This helps keep things from getting too repetitive. It can keep learners engaged, and it's also ensuring that all styles are represented. So for example, you may start with a simple lecture or a simple video. You may supplement that with workbooks or audio recordings, and then finally move on to being able to demonstrate those skills. But really the goal should be to try to touch on at least all 4 of these throughout your training so that it is, again, accessible to employees. So that was very quickly the first step, which again is training development. Next, we're going to talk about training delivery. So delivery is essentially the vehicle that the knowledge and skills are transferred through. So we'll be talking about types of training modalities, how you deliver your training, and how you engage with learners within these programs. So research has shown that training programs that are more engaging tend to yield stronger results. Fairly obvious, right? So where you tend to be more active and engaged, you tend to retain that information, you tend to be able to apply it within real-world contexts, and you tend to retain that information. So essentially what you see is the modalities where learners take a more active role also tend to be the most engaging. However, I think it's really important to notice that that doesn't make low or medium engagement modalities bad or ineffective. They are absolutely necessary components of training, but ideally they should be combined with some of those higher engagement activities. So if we look at low engagement types of modalities, these tend to include things that are oral or written presentations, things that don't really require participation from employees, things like lectures, giving them a video to watch, giving them a training manual or a handbook, or having them go through online slideshows. Obviously, these things are very necessary, right? They're necessary for communicating that base information. And again, that doesn't mean low engagement is bad. It certainly has its place within training, but should be combined with medium or high engagement modalities. So medium engagement, these tend to have a stronger emphasis on discussion or feedback. So you may combine your lecture with discussions between participants or between the facilitator and participants. You'll encourage them to ask questions. These may include quizzes or workbooks, or it may include programmed instruction. And when I say that, that really involves just breaking down instruction into smaller modules and ensuring learners can demonstrate their knowledge at each level. So as we were talking about with Bloom's taxonomy and PPE, that's really what programmed instruction is ensuring they have the base knowledge, that they can apply it in broad contexts, that they can demonstrate learning, and so on. And then those high engagement modalities tend to have trainees take a more active role in the learning process. So they tend to engage cognitively and behaviorally with the materials. So these might include things like tabletop exercises, simulated exercises, on-the-job training, or mentorship programs. And something I want to touch on really quickly is mentorships and coaching was something that was brought up a lot with the Campbell Institute Training Effectiveness Work Group. They really emphasized a structured relationship between EHS professionals and their employees to develop their knowledge or skills in the field. So this may mean having a one-on-one mentorship program. This may mean having group coaching, or looking at your incident rates or past incidents and having someone coach them in the proper way to maintain their safety. But we talked about mentorships a lot, and that was something that I believe all of the members really utilized and really valued as being part of their training program. And it not only creates that strong interpersonal relationship, but it can also sort of create a continuous improvement cycle in learning. And it ensures that that learning doesn't just take place in the classroom and then it's lost. They have somebody who can turn to who's more experienced, who they can ask questions, field questions, talk to, or just learn from. So I have another poll question for you all. And let me find it on my end. In your experience, which training modality do you think is most effective for safety training? So you should see that poll pop up on your end. I'm curious what you all think. Traditional classroom-based learning, online or e-learning, virtual or augmented reality, hands-on or on-the-job training, or blended learning. And I will again give you all just a couple minutes or a couple seconds to go through that poll. And thank you all to those of you who have jumped on that so quickly. All right, looks like we're slowing down just a little bit. So it looks like pretty overwhelmingly blended learning is portrayed as being the most effective, followed by hands-on or on-the-job training, and traditional classroom training, which is lagging behind at about 6%. So interesting that you all say that, because this tells me that you have a very strong grasp of training modalities and effectiveness. But I wanted to break down some of the newer and more innovative approaches to training and talk about what we're seeing in terms of the research and effectiveness. Let me end the poll. Thank you all for that. So the first thing I want to talk about is VR/AR training. So VR, virtual reality, and AR, augmented reality, are increasingly being used as a tool for delivering safety training. So when we're talking about virtual reality training, I think what we tend to think of is a person who has the VR goggles and the remotes in their hand, and they can do a full 360 and interact with objects. And that is certainly a component, but virtual reality can also just include looking on a computer screen or on a tablet. There's a really wide array of virtual reality modules out there. They're available off the shelf if you just need a basic safety training module, or if you are looking to do something a little more intensive, you can actually work with VR vendors who can build out a custom module for you. Of course, that tends to be more cost and resource intensive, but what we are seeing from the literature is that a primary benefit of VR or AR training is that it allows learners to really experience a semi-realistic environment and train on potentially hazardous situations in a very safe and controlled environment. So an example is emergency situations. So let's use the example of fire safety. So imagine a manufacturing facility where fire safety is really paramount. due to the materials handled or the processes. So traditional fire training might involve lectures, videos, and maybe a live demonstration if conditions allow. Where VR training can be useful is it can actually immerse them into that environment and allow them to safely make decisions and learn the consequences of those decisions. So if they're conducting a fire safety VR training, they may have guides that can pop up that can give them tips and tricks about, what the appropriate procedures are. They can safely make mistakes, right? And a big benefit of this is there's that ability to repeat this training over and over again. So if we're looking at fire safety, we've all been involved in, a fire drill. Those can be really disruptive, right? So it can, not only impact just that moment, but it also just tends to throw people off. It can impact productivity. It can really stand in the way of your operations. So VR training can be helpful in cases where you want a semi-realistic experience, but you want them to experience that in a safe environment. And research is preliminary on this. Virtual reality is still new and emerging, so I'm looking forward to seeing what the research says, but preliminary data is positive. So some of the benefits of VR are that they tend to have better learning outcomes compared to traditional training. Which isn't surprising because, again, as we talked about, it really allows them to engage with the training and to be more active in their own learning process. They tend to have increased engagement. There's the reduced cognitive load associated with VR training, so they don't have to work as hard to learn the information. And again, it can be repeated over and over and over again. But there are also considerations. So I'm certainly not recommending that everyone go out and buy a VR headset and you'll be good to go. It does require a lot of planning up front. From what I've heard from members of the work group and other member organizations is that they are using VR for some of their highest risk, most likely workplace hazards or workplace risks. So some of those considerations are the higher upfront investments. There's a lack of systemic evaluation techniques, which, as we progress and as this technology progresses, we'll start to see more models and looking at the effectiveness and the evaluation of virtual reality. And if you've ever used VR, it can be a little trippy sometimes. There is the potential for motion sickness. So something I recommend is if you are trying VR, I recommend having a couple of employees who can serve as sort of your digital champions, who can trial out this technology first and let you know what their experience was before you launch a full-scale pilot or adopt it across the organization. And you also want to, for those people who may be sensitive to VR, have an alternative for them available so that they can still get that training, but don't have to suffer through motion sickness if they're vulnerable to it. But I'm really interested and I'm really excited to see the future of VR. And it's certainly something that we're hearing a lot more talk about and a lot more adoption of VR. Next is blended learning. So blended learning, you all chose as being the most effective strategy. So blended learning is also known as hybrid learning. And it combines traditional classroom training with e-learning or online activities. And one of the strengths of blended learning is that it relies on this idea that learning is a continuous experience. Again, so you can have that traditional classroom training, you can establish that base level knowledge, and then use those more cost-effective e-learning or online activities to actually supplement that learning. So if we're looking at safety training, it may combine some of those face-to-face components like workshops or on-the-job training with online components like e-learning modules, video demonstrations, or discussion groups. So again, the research is really positive when it comes to blended learning. So preliminary research has found that there are stronger learning outcomes compared to purely online or purely classroom learning. So what we're seeing is that that blended approach tends to be stronger than if we just chose one or the other. Blended learning is also more cost effective, which we know is a huge benefit. So there was one study that found that blended learning reduced costs by about 24% compared to face-to-face learning. So this is another that we've been hearing a lot about, and I know a lot of organizations are starting to implement. And one that the training effectiveness work group also was very interested and very supportive of was this blended learning approach. And kind of on the same, in the same realm as blended learning is microlearning. So microlearning is also emerging as a potential supplement to longer, more comprehensive training. So essentially what microlearning does is it breaks down lessons into short, focused courses. So these are typically e-learning or online modules that tend to be less than 15 minutes. And these modules are really focused on a specific learning outcome. So the reason this is important is that evidence is showing that the human attention span is decreasing. So one study found that between the years of 2000 and 2013, the human attention span actually dropped from 12 seconds to 8 seconds. And I think it's important too to remember that as Gen Z is entering into the workforce, they are getting more and more used to short form content. So if we think about, 10 to 30-second TikToks, that is what they're becoming accustomed to through social media and through these platforms that they're using is this short form content. So there's really a need for it. And I think there's also a desire from those younger generations in terms of how they want to learn. They're interested in short, easily digestible training programs or training modules. And again, what we're seeing is that microlearning does have its benefits. It's been associated with better retention. So they're able to better pull that information later on. They tend to be more engaged and they tend to have higher confidence in what they're learning. As we talked with the Campbell Institute Training Effectiveness Work Group, they discussed that, given the short time frame, microlearning is not going to be suitable if you are just introducing a topic, if it's more complex or if it's more advanced. So for example, a representative from the Chemers company shared that they use microlearning as refreshers. So they do the initial training in person or through lectures, however they choose to do it. And then they actually use these microlearnings to refresh that information later on. So this can help it keep it from feeling cumbersome, right? If they've already learned this information, a quick 15-minute refresher is likely going to be a lot more effective than having them sit through another hour. And it can also help them feel more engaged in the training. Something else that I've also been hearing, which is going to be really interesting, is combining location geofencing with these microlearnings. So I've heard of some organizations who have some sort of location tracking with their employees. And when they enter a specific zone of a facility or a specific area of a construction site, they can actually automatically be sent different short training modules. So it might show them, for example, if they're close to a machine, how to safely turn off that machine. It might show them how to, if they are up high on a construction site, it might just send them quick reminders of working at height safety tips. So that is one place that is emerging that I am very curious to see how it's going to pan out. But again, microlearnings can be really, really useful if you are just wanting a quick refresher. And again, it can also help your cost effectiveness of your training program. The last thing we want to think about is our learning exchange. So learning exchanges kind of happen in three main ways. And all three, again, give the opportunity for learners to demonstrate their knowledge. There is facilitator to participant, where the trainer delivers content directly to learners, things like lectures or demonstrations. Participant to participant, which really encourages a collaborative environment for trainees. So you may have trainees teach each other different topics or lead a discussion. And then there's facilitator to, or participant to facilitator. And this is kind of that teach the teacher ideology, where participants can take a more active role. They can provide feedback, ask questions, or even teach or talk to their facilitator about their experience. And this all creates a feedback loop between the facilitator and participants. And last thing I want to touch on is that last step, which is measuring effectiveness. So as we've discussed, a poorly delivered or an ineffective training can have a laundry list of negative impacts on the organization. Evaluation allows employers to make changes or updates to build a stronger, more effective program. And I included this figure of the continuous improvement model as a reminder that evaluating your training program is really no different than implementing other changes. You want to plan for the change, implement the change on a smaller scale, evaluate the results, and then act on what is learned. So ideally, training should be looked at as a continuous improvement process rather than just a one-off training, repeated periodically. So I have another poll question, and the question is, how often has your organization formally evaluated the effectiveness of its safety training programs? Are you doing it regularly, after every training session, periodically, which is around once or twice a year, occasionally after major revisions or updates, rarely, only in response to safety incidents, or never? Interesting. So it looks like we have so far a pretty even split. So it looks like occasionally might be pulling out, so after major changes or updates. Great, so it looks like occasionally came in first, followed by rarely and periodically. So that is kind of what we would expect, right? Ideally, you'll want to evaluate your safety training right after you make any major changes, after there are changes to your procedures or updates to the regulations. We'll talk a little more about that here in just a second. So if you are interested in evaluating your training, one model that I recommend is the Kirkpatrick model. So there are a lot of different models out there, but for today, we'll be focusing on the Kirkpatrick model. It has been a widely studied and utilized model. You've likely heard of it before. And it essentially breaks down effectiveness into 4 major categories: reaction, learning, behavior, and results. So as you move up the pyramid, the complexity and the impact increase, but the availability of data decreases. So we'll start at level 1, which is reaction. So at this level, you really want to understand how participants reacted to the training. Did they find the training favorable? Did they find it engaging? Did they find it relevant? So we talked in the work group a lot about how to measure this. And there's a report out currently where you can see some of these questions. But the work group came up with a lot of questions that you can ask participants to gauge their reaction. So examples might be, I feel more knowledgeable about my job. I have the skills needed because of this training. I will work more effectively because of this training. I feel engaged in this training. And members of the work group were asked how they are currently measuring reactions. And essentially they've came up with 4 key ways, which were survey questionnaires, open discussions, instructor forums, and e-learning feedback. So level 1 is really all about collecting some of that information and really gauging their reaction. At the second level, you want to know the extent to which they acquired the intended knowledge or skills. So at this level, it should primarily consist of objective measures. So you want to consider things like post-training assessments or quizzes, having them role play or simulate or demonstrate a new learning. Granger mentioned that they use knowledge checks throughout their training. AECOM mentioned that they actually track IT requests, which I thought was really, really interesting because that can show you if there are potential technical barriers to training that need to be addressed. And that was something that I personally hadn't thought of, that I thought was a really smart way to look at those potential barriers. You can also combine these with observational data. So conducting floor walks, observations, talking with employees, all of this can be used to gauge their understanding of safety principles. The third level is behavior. So how well can participants apply what they have learned? Employee behavior can be assessed through observations, through collecting feedback, or through interviews or surveys. And something that I really want to reiterate is that most members of the working group indicate that they're using some form of coaching and correction, which helps them engage in follow-up conversations and measure safety observations. This may be through floor walks, through having open discussions, through one-on-one discussions, but they really reiterated having that sort of continuous improvement model in order to continuously measure if that behavior is being applied. And then lastly, results. So the final stage is understanding the impact of your training on the larger organizational goals and objectives. So this involves looking at the long-term impacts on safety indicators. So depending on how you are measuring your safety, you may look at reductions in incident rates before and after the training. You may look at your injury rates. You may look at compliance rates. You may look at employee engagement. But being able to look at some of those key performance indicators and understand what impact the training had. And something that the work group did was they took the Kirkpatrick model. They, amongst discussions with themselves, they actually came up with a pre and post test process for measuring effectiveness, which I think really concisely incorporates all of these elements into one model that I think is simpler, easier to break down, and can be really effective if you want to measure changes. And when we talk about a pre and post test design, that simply means you're measuring changes before or after a change has been implemented. So in this case, it may mean you've implemented a new module, a new program, maybe you're trying a new modality. But this was created by that training effectiveness work group. And it's broken down into two phases. The first phase occurs before training is delivered. So in that first step, employees assess their job relevant knowledge. So at this stage, through surveys or questionnaires or open discussions, you want to understand how employees feel about their own perception of what they know. So this helps promote self-awareness and a sense of responsibility for employees, where they can actually discuss with you where they feel comfortable or confident in areas where they feel they may need additional training. Step two is incorporating external feedback from supervisors or colleagues. And this is really a check for those self-assessments, right? So this is where you can identify places where there may be some misalignment and encourage continuous improvement over time. This step can also help capture a more holistic picture of employee performance and take into account things like interactions or impacts from team dynamics. And then that third step is third-party observations. So here, an impartial observer can assess the employee performance and offer an unbiased view. So these can help uncover insights that may have been missed in that second step and provide a neutral benchmark for performance. So all of this then creates a holistic overview of that employee's performance, right? So they're able to assess how they think they're performing. Their supervisor can assess what their strengths and perhaps opportunities for improvement are. And then a third party observer can actually help to assess their performance and give an unbiased view. So you've implemented that change into your training, and then you move to the post-test process. So this is phase two, and this occurs after the training is delivered. So the first three steps you'll see are identical to that pre-test phase. Again, you're talking to employees about their perceptions. You're talking to supervisors about their observations, and you're gathering third-party observations. But what this adds on is those objective metrics and measures. So in that step 4, data analysis and measuring effectiveness, This is where you can look at those indicators, look at your incident rates, your injuries, your compliance, and you can actually see where there are some quantitative differences based off of your training. Something I want to note is that while it's tempting to evaluate training based just off of lagging indicators like incident rates, it's also important to consider some leading indicators. So taking a look at your risk assessments, doing risk profiles, looking at preventative and corrective actions that occurred before an incident occurred, or taking surveys of your employees can all really help you understand from a holistic standpoint how well your training is working. And again, that pre-test, post-test phase is discussed a lot more in that paper and was informed by that Campbell Institute Training Effectiveness Work Group. So I know that was a lot of information. So what are those key takeaways? So during training, you want to consider the gaps in existing safety knowledge or skills. You want to form learning objectives, what workers should be able to do, demonstrate, or explain. And you want to understand your target audience and address any potential barriers to making that training accessible. Again, the more engaging the training, the better the uptake. And a blended approach does tend to encourage continuous learning while keeping things cost effective and giving workers some of that autonomy back, right? Measuring effectiveness is critical. So you can use the Kirkpatrick model, you can use a different model, you can use that pre-test, post-test model that we shared, but making sure that you are evaluating your training programs is going to be huge for making sure that it is accomplishing what you want it to accomplish and that your resources are being used to their best, the best that they can. And if you are measuring the effectiveness, you want to make sure it's a mix of observational data and objective metrics. So you can certainly use walkthroughs, observations, discussions with employees, but you want to make sure that you are combining that with things like assessments, quizzes, looking at your safety KPIs, you're taking interviews. So long story short, you want to make sure that you're evaluating your effectiveness and you want to make sure that your employees are involved and that you are getting those observational and objective measures. I have one last poll question and then we can take it over to question and answer. My question is, what future research would be most helpful to you in the area of safety training? And again, this will be really helpful to us as we sort of move forward to understanding what knowledge gaps are out there and how we can help. All right, so it looks like guides or toolkits is overwhelmingly the choice. So we will certainly keep that in mind as we move forward. And I'll let this poll continue to go for a little bit longer. But I know I'm running short on time. Again, thank you all for joining me. If you have any questions, I will try to address one or two right now. But I do want to plug that you can find this full report at thecampbellinstitute.org if you're interested in learning more. So the first question I see is the issue I have with training is backing from management, a lot of lip service, but not actual process and progress. So I think personally, and certainly if anyone wants to reach out to Stacy to share their experience, I would encourage it. Something that helps is presenting what an ineffective training, how that can really negate potential safety benefits, is coming to them with that research. And again, there's more of that research in the paper, so hopefully that can help you. But presenting the research, showing them the importance of training and how that can help with their costs, how that can help save time and resources, and really being able to build up that business case for safety training. And again, take a look at that paper as we talk about some of those key considerations. I'll take one more question and I'll give it back to you, Steph. What are some best practices you can share to encourage employees, especially when they've been in their role a long time? So Natalie, this is a great question. And something that I would recommend is allowing them to be involved in the training, right? So we talked about training the trainer or training participants. So allowing them to be involved, getting their input on training, seeing how they feel about different modalities, seeing what worked for them and what didn't, trying to engage with them as best you can and making them feel like they're part of that program. I think I am all out of time, so I'll pass it over to Steph, but certainly if you have any questions, feel free to email me or send any questions over to Stephanie and the Campbell team, and I will address those.
Thank you, Kenna, so much. Really appreciate it. I know there were some unanswered questions in the Q&A, so if you feel like emailing those to Kenna or myself, you're more than welcome. It's just our names at nsc.org. So kenna.carlson@nsc.org or stephanie.roberts@nsc.org. You can advance the slides. I just have, I know we're over. I just want to add a few comments about some upcoming events that we have. So next slide, please. There you go. So we have our Future of EHS event happening February 20th through 22nd. Sorry, my computer just froze. Happening 20th through 22nd. This is a really great event for safety leaders to get involved in. So you can see a few of the session topics we have here. Registration is open at nsc.org/future of EHS. That registration ends on February 16th. You can go to the next slide. Just also wanted to let you all know that we have a call for presentations for our Congress and Expo event happening September 16th through the 18th in Orlando, Florida. So those will be open and you're welcome to submit some proposals for those presentations. And if you have any questions about those, feel free to reach out, stephanie.roberts@nsc.org. So thank you all again so much. This recording will be sent out in a thank you email next week, probably early next week, Monday or Tuesday. But again, any questions, reach out, and I hope you all have a good day. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.